Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the enormous privilege of serving as president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true as it has for 150 years, whether on campus or online. When Thomas Hunter, an Irish immigrant, founded this institution a century and a half ago, he affirmatively welcomed students of every race, religion, social class, and heritage. Just think about that for a moment. Hunter College welcomed Black women into higher education in the 1870s, a time when most women of any race did not go much beyond middle school. Our founder's courageous vision made Hunter College a pioneer in the education of women and the integration of American higher education. Since the 1870s, Hunter College has been the alma mater of some of our country's most influential Black women. Think of the great feminist and civil rights lawyer, Pauli Murray, of the class of 1933, whose legal theory that separate was inherently unequal became the basis for the Supreme Court's historic Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Think of Ruby Dee, Hunter High School class of 1939 and Hunter College class of 1945, who is not only an award-winning actress, but a poet, playwright, screenwriter, journalist, and civil rights activist. And then there is the wonderful Audre Lorde, class of 1959, whose powerful poetry and prose exposed the injustices of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Generation after generation, Hunter's long-standing commitment to diversity has not wavered, and today it is stronger than ever. Our motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine, has never meant more than it does at this time. With the fabric of our society under extreme strain, a stubborn pandemic, and a long-needed reckoning with racial injustice, we are recommitting ourselves to making sure that the future is safer, healthier, and more equitable for our students, our faculty, our school, and our city. The future will not automatically improve. We must work together now to level the systemic disparities that have prevented us from achieving a more perfect union. In the wake of the unconscionable killing of George Floyd, and in recognition of the movement that came before it and that it inspired, we are developing new initiatives at Hunter to confront the traumatic impact of systemic racism and forge a more inclusive learning and working environment. We have launched a presidential task force bringing together faculty, staff, and students to consider and recommend new programs, policies, curricular changes, and practices that confront racism, prevent implicit bias, and address microaggressions. We are also expanding our counseling and student support services. And tonight, Hunter introduces a special new series of virtual public programs to engage our campus community in important conversations that explore the historic, social, and political roots of racism and the urgent need to remedy it. This series, called Speaking of Justice, Race, Racism, and Reform, begins tonight with an exploration, Protest as a Path to Progress, Making Black Lives Matter. This evening's discussion will look back at the origins and impacts of American social protest and reflect on that history as it laid the groundwork and informs the current movements for justice and equality, as well as Hunter's own initiatives. Before we start, I want to thank the Hunter team that has worked with faculty and students tirelessly to produce this series, particularly Dean John Rose, our inspiring Dean of Diversity, and himself a Hunter alum, and historian Harold Holzer, our Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, which is co-sponsoring this series of events. We could not have a more distinguished panel tonight to engage in this important discussion. First, it is a pleasure to welcome scholar and documentary filmmaker Lazaro Lima, Professor of Latino Studies at Hunter's groundbreaking Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies. Dr. Lima is the author of the impactful book, The Latino Body: Crisis Identities in American Literary and Critical Thinking. Welcome, Laz, and thank you. And welcome also to Shavana Newsom, co-founder of the Greater New York chapter of Black Lives Matter. Shavana was born and raised in the Bronx and was recently a candidate for Congress in this, her home borough. We are so pleased to welcome you to our community, Shavana, and hope we remain connected after tonight. We're also so pleased to welcome Dr. Calvin John Smiley, Assistant Professor in Hunter's Sociology Department, a scholar of race, inequality, and social justice. Calvin is the co-editor of Prison Reentry in the 21st Century, Critical Perspectives of Returning Home. Thank you also, Calvin. Our moderator tonight will be Hunter History Professor DeWeston Haywood, who specializes in the 20th century with an emphasis on protest movements, Black masculinity, and the intersection of Black culture and Black politics. Dr. Haywood is the author of Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement. Before Professor Haywood begins, I want to share a few words that were spoken on our Hunter campus by Dr. Martin Luther King 55 years ago. We are in an era, he said, in which the issue of human rights is the central question confronting all nations. We must admit that half a century later, the central question Dr. King raised has yet to be answered fully. The time has come to learn from the past and move forward toward a more equitable future. That is our goal for tonight and for this entire series. We look forward to the discussion this evening and to welcoming you to this series. Thank you so much to our panelists and all our guests for joining us. And let us thank and welcome our moderator, Dr. DeWeston Haywood of Hunter College.
Thank you, President Rabb, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am your moderator, DeWeston Haywood. And each of us on the panel, myself, Lazaro Lima, Calvin John Smiley, and Shavana Newsom will share some brief opening comments that will be followed by a moderated discussion. So I want to begin my comments with this short clip from the PBS documentary, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, by Henry Louis Gates.
Young people come first.
By the end of April in 1960, over 50,000 students had staged sit-ins throughout the South. They were becoming the vanguard of the civil rights struggle. But they had little support or encouragement from the movement's leadership, accustomed to employing less aggressive tactics.
Activism was not the style of the civil rights movement. Some of our elders thought it was a bit much to be putting yourself up for jail and violence. They certainly refused to see young people as a part of their struggle.
A little-known 56-year-old civil rights veteran named Ella Baker would change that. Ella Baker, granddaughter of slaves, had been a grassroots organizer all over the South for 2 decades, a quiet but radical force.
She would say, like the turtle, you have to put your tail on the line. And students could understand that. And we did put our tails on the line.
Now, together with students less than half her age, Baker helped found a new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC.
The level at which SNCC operated was the most dangerous level. It was the shock troop level. They went into the towns and the places where segregation ran amok. They were in parts of the South that can only be called terrorist.
Historically, civil rights and many other movements are top-down. Mrs. Baker believed that the ultimate source of power is at the level where the people are. Up here does not direct down here. Down here directs up there.
The day has come when racism must be banished.
So many people of your generation, you two, describe her as this visionary force. Why isn't she a household word of the civil rights movement?
Because the movement was, I hate to say this, it was dominated by ministers and religious leaders, and they didn't see a role for women in leadership position.
Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son.
That was Ella Baker.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens.
She took the long sweep of her life and her experiences and poured it into young folks.
Ella Baker and SNCC helped the civil rights movement broaden and gain momentum.
So in that clip, we see deep echoes from the past. In our present moment, we heard Ella Baker herself, right, in that clip say, the day has come when racism must be banished. And this she was saying in the 1960s, as she was trying to guide a new generation of young Black activists to lead a movement for racial equality. So there was urgency then to end racism, just like there was urgency in the decades and centuries that led her to make that statement, right, before. And certainly there remains an urgency today in 2020. So if you're wondering about what about this time is different, I think it's useful to look at Ella Baker among others. She organized young people, mostly college students, who were disaffected with some of the strategies of the civil rights movement, but were also disaffected with the country's inertia around racial equality. So they would help promote a more militant and confrontational approach to activism, some of which would center sit-ins over marching, right? To expose and dismantle white supremacy in all its forms, from the simple everyday quotidian forms to the more entrenched, legalized, and institutionalized forms. So after years of activism, the civil rights movement helped achieve crucial legislation, the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65 and 68, for example. But many activists thought that these victories were but preludes, right, to a greater political and social ensemble that was to come. Much of white America, however, thought that this was the beginning of the end of Black activism, that many of the demands had been met, right? A virulent and oftentimes violent white backlash crystallized across white America to ensure that end came legislatively and through policing. But again, if you're wondering, what about this time is different? I think it's also useful to pan north and take a look at James Baldwin. On July 11th, 1966, almost 50 years to the day, right? Baldwin, the famed Black writer and social critic, publishes an essay called A Report from Occupied Territory. It was his observation of recent urban rebellions in cities like Harlem, Watts, Philly, as well as his assessment of the endemic police brutality that had helped spark those rebellions to begin with. He called these communities, which had long been impoverished, police-dominated spaces, occupied territories. And just a few months later, in October 1966, two young Black activists, Hugh Newton and Bobby Seale, founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, an organization that would go on to attract thousands of Black youth to its membership, some of whom were formerly members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they would also attract thousands of non-Black youth to its ideas and activism. In May 1967, they issued the 10-point program, their manifesto demanding, and I quote, an immediate end to police brutality. This alongside other crucial demands for decent housing, employment, and an end to capitalist exploitation in Black communities. these demands might have seemed radical, right? But they located these demands within the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So I think what we are witnessing today is a 400-year reckoning for demands unanswered, right? A new generation of young Black activists who are marking the next phase of the Black freedom struggle in this country. And certainly this echoes back past Black movements, precisely because so many of the issues these movements put forward, issues that were placed squarely before the public, squarely before the federal government, have still gone unanswered. So I'll now turn the mic over to Professor Lima.
Thanks, DeWeston, for that introduction and for your leadership in really engaging in this conversation. It really is my hope that in my comments, I have the opportunity to both share some intellectual inquietudes that are really central to some of the topics that we've been discussing, but also for me to learn from our fellow panelists and certainly from audience members who might be asking questions. So I want to begin simply by just framing what I do in terms of being a teacher and a scholar. And that is, I study Latinos, which is to say that I study the cultural, literary, and political histories of people of Latin American ancestry living in the United States. And I say that because oftentimes in the public sphere, we conflate Latinos with Hispanics writ large. And it bears repeating that Latinos, like African Americans, bear a particular relationship to American cultural history and jurisprudence. So for example, through a 1954 Supreme Court case, Hernandez versus Texas, 14th Amendment protections were extended to Latinos, that is, described as people of Latin American ancestry in the United States. And this is significant because international pedagogies, both Black history and Brown history, have been obviated to symbolic oblivion. And I think part of what the decolonizing work that we do, and the decolonizing work that I hope I do at my best, is precisely making these historical lacunae more visible. So it's important to understand also how Black and Brown communities have responded creatively and with great courage in order to redress these structural questions. So another way of saying that is I study how the nation's most disenfranchised communities are perfecting and fortifying democratic practice through demands for justice and structural redress. So in the few moments that I have, I really want to talk about two things. I want to talk about protest, and I want to talk about coalitional politics so that we can get a sense of both how we got here and perhaps understand how the templates that have served us previously might provide a path forward. So to speak of protest, and I often share this with students, speak of protest is really to understand it as the public expression of outrage in the face of injustice. So protest is therefore fundamentally concerned with questions of justice and of redress. That is, how to make just what has been broken and how to repair what has been broken within the broader democratic commons. So these are some of the gifts that Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities have bequeathed to the nation. And oftentimes they don't register on a national scale for reasons that have to do with structural inequalities that are fundamental to understanding our moment. So central to the idea of redress is really the question of historical accounting and accountability. So part of the structural violence that happens in our national pedagogies, that is the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, is how we perpetuate violence every time we ignore how history gets whitewashed. When we, for example, tell the story of Thomas Jefferson, but not Sally Hemings, we participate in that historical whitewashing. When we exclude Ella Baker from the story of the Civil Rights Movement, we ignore Black female agency and we deprive our citizens and citizens in the making of templates from which to understand their lives moving forward. And when we as educators don't insist on making these historical absences central to our own pedagogies, we perpetuate historical whitewashing. So I want to just center the Black experience as itself central and constitutive of the American experience, so we understand historical whitewashing as another way to draw attention to the violence that it perpetuates. So Black and brown political bodies have been active historical agents in the project called Perfectible Democracy, what I'm here calling Perfectible Democracy. And also they've been doing that through coalitional politics. So let me transition into coalitional politics so that we can get a better framing for our moment and begin to understand the many communities that have been active in pushing the BLM agenda in significant ways, following the BLM template that has been so central from Ferguson onward. So Black and brown activists and intellectuals and seekers of justice have been practicing coalitional politics before the historical record usually indicates it, which is during the civil rights movement of the 60s. And I believe they've lessons for us because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And one of the key things that I want as a takeaway, and especially for those students that are eager and anxious for understanding this historical moment, and to have the historical vocabulary through which they can apprehend this moment, is to see this in context and really beyond what conventional political science or political theory scholarship might say about coalitional politics. The demands of Black and brown activists have always centered on at least 3 demands. And these 3 demands have to do with 1, economic justice, 2, racial justice and judicial reform, and 3, historical accounting. That is what I've here called historical redress. And I just want to give, especially the students out there anxious for foremothers and forefathers in this history, but one brief example that has to do with the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. So the campaign was a coalition of predominantly Black, Latino, Native American activists under the leadership of Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who led the campaign in the wake of King's assassination in April of that year. But it was also under the leadership of Chicano activists, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, that this movement gave momentum across the country, and it didn't just become an urban locus of protest, but rather a broadly national locus of protest, from farm workers in the field who were both Filipino and brown, and let us say it, also Black. It became a way of understanding how this program, organized initially under King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, ultimately became a framework for pushing forward social justice as inexorably linked to historical accountability and racial equity. And the campaign itself really had clarity about their goals, and I'm really seeing that in this particular moment. Why they demanded economic and human rights for poor Americans of all backgrounds, they centered their demands around the most culturally and structurally disenfranchised Black and brown bodies. And the campaign was instrumental in presenting an organized set of demands to Congress, to executive agencies, as well as the Department of Justice, where they demanded police reform, among other things. And after doing so, thousands of these participants set up a protest camp on the Washington Mall, where they stayed for 6 weeks in the spring of 1968. If we could cue in the first slide that I had, it'll give us a sense of how we've obviated this particular moment by not having an understanding of the centrality of Black and brown lives. One of the tactics that they used was the stay in. Now, you might recall, and again, especially to those students that are listening, we might be more familiar with the notion of sit in, that is when we go to counters and protest exclusively white spaces. The stay in was a tactic born out of bringing Black, brown, and indigenous peoples together to privileged spheres and centers of whiteness. So think of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and its significance in this. It's okay to bring the slide down. Thank you, Daniel, for sharing that. And it led ultimately to other projects of liberation, which coalesced in the Brown Chicano Moratorium in August 1970 in protest of the Vietnam War. in order to demand that we understand the Black and brown body not as an exchangeable commodity under capital, but rather as a constitutive agent of American cultural history. So part of the challenge that happens right now is this historical amnesia regarding this moment, and how we as educators in particular have to be very clear about one, seeding way to younger activists that really have their game down, and also providing the reinforcement as necessary by providing the historical vocabulary that might give more nuance to why this is a bridge to a future that necessarily means perfectible democratic practice. So I'm really looking forward to what my colleagues have to share about that, and in a robust discussion that we might have amongst ourselves. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to present these observations.
Now, Professor Calvin John Smiley.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and so just bear with me for 1 second. So I hope everyone can see that there. So as this talk is entitled, Protest as a Path to Progress, Making Black Lives Matter, I want to first just thank President Rob, Hunter community, and my esteemed colleagues for allowing me to present some ideas on this panel. So I've broken down my talk or my brief intro comments into kind of 3 small sections. So first, how did we get here? Second, Black Lives Matter research that I've done. And finally, where do we go from here? And I thought, to start, just that image by Kathir Nelson with all of the folks that we have lost due to either police brutality or frankly, just white supremacy. So how did we get here? I think this is a question that's really bearing on this conversation. And as DeWeston had mentioned, the Black Panther Party, I chose this image of many that I was thinking about, but the very first Black Panther newsletter that was published in April of 1967 dealt with the police killing of Denzel Dowell. So we know that police-involved shootings of unarmed Black folks is nothing new. We can trace this all the way back to slave patrols, to convict leasing, and then much of the impetus of 1960s resistance, particularly in northern urban cities. Many of the rebellions that we saw in Watts, Chicago, Newark, Detroit in the 1960s, the kind of proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was a police-involved arrest, harassment, or some form of brutality. So, this is kind of the framework of where we're at. And, how are things changing? Well, the proliferation of social media and technology. I think in 2016, Will Smith said it best. Racism isn't getting worse, it is just getting filmed. So, the kind of age-old adages that many law enforcement officers used was, the assailant or the perpetrator was resisting. They went for their gun, or the fact that they themselves were scared of the person that they were trying to arrest. And in these kind of objective video and pictures that we see, and oftentimes this is not the case, where someone is not resisting. One of the more famous videos right now is that of Walter Scott in South Carolina. The police officer wrote up the report that Walter Scott went for his gun, they were fighting. And in the video that was, taken by sheer luck, we see that that was not the case, that Walter Scott was shot in the back as he tried to actually flee the officer who was trying to manhandle him. Starting with the Obama era, we really see that the taking of Black life is kind of a constant and dominant theme of his presidency. Only 19 or so days prior to him being inaugurated as the first African-American president, we see Oscar Grant killed on the platform of a BART station in Oakland, California, while his hands are handcuffed behind his back. And this was really one of the first kind of modern 21st century viral videos of watching someone being shot and killed on camera, and that going viral on different outlets such as YouTube, Twitter, and other social media devices. And then we also see towards the end of Obama's presidency, even people like Philando Castile, who was killed in July of 2016, and his girlfriend Diamond, Facebook Live streaming this, showing what had happened to her partner. And this has kind of spilled over into the Trump era as well, with the killings of Bontham Jean, George Floyd, and others like Breonna Taylor. One of the things that's really important to know is that the age of social media and technology has also been a way for organizers and activists to actually bridge borders and boundaries. So one example I'll give is during the Ferguson uprising, many times we saw activists across the world, particularly in places like Palestine, who had dealt with these kind of militarized policing, tweeting out how to deal with being pepper sprayed and what to use to kind of flush out one's eyes, or to kind of keep one's eyes safe from tear gas and other types of weaponry that law enforcement had been using. When it comes to BLM research that I've done, I want to talk about two articles briefly that I have written. The first, From Brute to Thug, the demonization and criminalization of unarmed Black males, that I and a colleague wrote, really looks at how Black victims of police brutality are posthumously criminalized to both justify and negate their deaths by law enforcement. So some of the images I have up here, in the case of Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old boy killed in Cleveland, Ohio, the Cleveland newspaper were writing articles with titles saying, "Lawyer representing Tamir Rice's family defended boy's mom in drug trafficking case." Right? Had no kind of premise to the fact that this young boy was killed by police, but a way to kind of negate and justify his death. The other two images is of Akai Gurley, who was killed here in Brooklyn, New York in November of 2014. Some news outlets had actually used an old mugshot of Mr. Gurley that was a decade old in their saying that he was the victim of a police shooting. And then other news outlets such as the New York Post entitling news articles saying "living in fear of the death hellhole houses," right? So again, once again, a way to negate their deaths as well as justify what the law enforcement have done. The second article, Released in the Era of BLM, the Nexus of Black Lives Matter and Prisoner Reentry, looks at my work around reentry and really takes into account how activism, and we like to think of activism as, folks who go out and, put both their minds and their bodies on the line. But for those who have been formerly incarcerated, this takes on a whole new and different meaning. For many of the men and women I worked with, they're very hesitant to go to protests and marches. Initially, because if they were still on parole, probation, or other forms of criminal justice supervision, one of the stipulations oftentimes under criminal justice guidelines is that you cannot fraternize with other known felons. So if you were to be arrested and someone else also is arrested who is also under criminal justice supervision, this could be a violation. Or the simple fact of just being arrested could be a violation, and your freedom could be terminated and you could be sent back to prison. And so where do we go from here? So I'll just say these briefly and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about them. But one thing is the idea of how people have used terms like riots, rebellion, and revolution interchangeably. I would argue that there are distinct differences between them and that they all lend to different pathways of resistance. The second, coming out of this movement, we've seen the hashtag defund the police and the abolition movement. So again, the defund the police is not just taking money away from police, but it's really a divest and reinvest movement. And abolition is not just an eradication movement, but it's an eradication and replacement movement. And again, I can speak more on that later on. And finally, for our educators, one thing that we really have to be cognizant of is how do we use our educational tools to make space in classrooms to have these discussions and have these conversations with our students, particularly folks who are coming from urban, low income, Black and brown communities that are, this is not just an exercise in scholarship, but their lived experiences of having to deal with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. And finally, we need to cite Black and non-white scholars So there's been a movement of decolonizing the syllabus, and this is something that we all have to do. So thank you.
All right, Shavonna Newsom.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can.
Oh, sorry. Let me go full screen. I kind of didn't see the mute button. What I was discussing was, after first thanking everyone, and it's such an honor to be on this panel, my perspective comes from being on the front line. Some may say I was born into this revolution. My parents met in 1969 at a protest here in New York City, and they were advocating and protesting for Black history to be taught by Black teachers here in the Bronx. So it just kind of carried on, being woke, being conscious. I know a lot of people reach out and they ask me, how do you relay this to children? I think if you find a way to properly do that, your kids will turn into organizers, leaders, and activists. We're at a pivotal point right now as a person who's been on the front lines for a very long time, marching for Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, against the Muslim bans, because that's the biggest misconception about Black Lives Matter Greater New York. We are for the full liberation of Black people. Most of the time we're highlighted in the media when there is a police killing, when one of our Black men or women are murdered. But in the interim, we are feeding people. Our 10-point plan is very much so like that of the Black Panther Party. So we want equal jobs, we want a guaranteed income, we want education, we want to end this wealth disparity, and we're carrying on the work. I love to share my personal experience just being on the ground in Minnesota, being here in New York, being a leader in this movement and being a woman in this movement. As we saw with the earlier chats of Ella Baker, very few women get to be in the position that I am in. Even though many of us are co-founders, many of us have been organizers for a very long time, it takes on a different role in terms of dealing with patriarchy within activism and with dismantling it in America as a whole as far as white supremacy. So I'm honored to be on the front line. I wish to share my experience and let people know why we're truly protesting. I believe that the powers that be, the people who control this government, this system, thought that if we had a few simple arrests of officers who had murdered George Floyd and the other victims, it's becoming too many victims to count at this point, that the people would stop. But this wasn't a movement, this is a movement. And in this revolution, we're seeing it turn into a multiple issues towards Black liberation, from defunding the police, which is simply the reallocation of police forces and investing those monies into communities, mutual aids, mental health, schools, education. New York City has about an $11 billion budget. We just lost the fight on that, but we've had wins in this recent time. With this being the largest civil rights movement any of us have ever seen, and the world has seen, because we're receiving calls out of Tel Aviv, out of Australia, out of Europe. What this is different is we're not stopping. I don't think any other activist in my age range has seen the level of commitment that people have. And we want the full liberation of Black people. And we understand that that comes with more than just repealing 50A, which hides officers' misconduct. We need to end qualified immunity. We need to end the wealth disparity, housing injustice. Black people need reparations. I believe that we should cut that check, point blank, period, because we see other groups who have been wronged by this world have received compensation for that. We need to equal our education. And what we don't want is, when I say we, I'm talking about people of the movement and people of my organization, which I'm the co-founder of, is we do not want equality. We know that that is a myth. We just want equity. We don't want our melanin to block our access from creating whatever someone's defined version of the American dream is. And where my organization differs a little bit is we understand that nothing happens for marginalized people unless there is legislation behind it. So if we're protesting, if we're demanding justice, if we're holding a 25,000 person rally in Times Square, it's something that we recently unleashed as the Black Act, which is about 24 pieces of legislation to uplift our people. We're calling for immediate firing. So yes, people take to the streets. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, that riots are the cries of the unheard. There's some strategy behind it, and I wish to share that with the world. Like, my team is made up of lawyers, forensic accountants. We are opening up a school. So activism it's in the works. I know that the public likes to show the vandalism, the press likes to show the highlight reel videos, but there's some real work being done across all boards and people who consider themselves activists and organizing. And it's the eradication of poverty. It's the uplifting and the full liberation of Black people. And I hope to be able to share that with all of you today.
Right, so thank you to all our panelists. And I think we're in agreement that this isn't necessarily anything new, right? That we see the seeds of this movement coming out of other movements, if we want to say a decade ago with the founding of Black Lives Matter as an organization, or well before in the 60s, arguably before that too. But also considering that historical trajectory of when things might have begun, but also when things end, and how they ended and why they ended. And so I wonder if you all can speak to how we build a sustainable movement now, and how we sort of avoid some of those pitfalls, some of which were beyond the control of activists. But I wonder if you can speak to that.
I think the way that we move forward now is we have to be students of history. And my very limited off time, those wee hours that you may have before you actually retire to bed, I and the rest of my team, we study history. We look at what happened with the Black Panther Party. We are quite familiar with COINTELPRO. We understand how the government wants to tear organizations like ours apart. We understand, most recently, Donald Trump tweeted about my brother, my fellow co-founder, about treason and insurrection and a whole bunch of words from the Constitution trying to paint us out as criminals. I think what's sustainable is to understand the error of our ways, not to fall prey to our ego, not to be distracted from what the true meaning is, and to coalition build. I think what's troublesome to the powers that be at this time is the movement is very decentralized. Right now, Black Lives Matter Global has about 16 chapters, and then there are 400 internationally of people operating. We are not an official member of their global network, but it's a movement the same way that the civil rights movement was. So we have to study history and we have to move forward. And I think right now that the people are holding the power. It's a time in the American government where it's a government that's working for the people, and social media plays a huge part of it, it being a COVID pandemic. But we have to stick to what we want. We can't be distracted, and we just can't fall prey to the perils that have hindered our progress in the past.
So this point about coalitional politics, I wonder if we can broaden that, if we can elaborate what that term means, and Professor Lima and Professor Smiley, if you can also add to that.
There seems to be an element of intersectional work that's being undertaken in these recent protests that I just haven't seen before. So I was sharing a little bit about tactics that some activists have been using, and that, you know, I study from afar as a scholar, whether it's the sit-in or anything else. The invocation recently of calls for a white shield, for example, are tactically really incredibly useful, because I see young white people recognizing their privilege in ways that generationally I could not have seen even 5 or 6 years before. So this calling and this hailing, if you will, of a broad constituency to provide literally a shield and metaphorically a visual document and testament to the fact that police will not hurt white young people in the way that they hurt Black and brown young people is significant, because it creates an archive of meaning that gets circulated through the Twitter sphere, through various media strata, that allows us to begin to see how justice is something that is done in tandem with a series of goals that demand that we all live up to forms of perfectible democracy. So what I'm seeing right now is really encouraging, and it makes me hopeful, because not only are younger activists more woke, but they're also more clear on how to share strategies and know the distinctions between strategies and tactics. While White Shield might be a tactic, the broader strategy is replicating that image of how police are not likely to hit white protesters as they are Black protesters, and do that double meme screen that Sean King, for example, shares, and many of other activists do. So coalitional politics looks different right now because it's intersectional. It is about bringing to the fore questions of gender equity that are intimately tied to equity writ large and to economic justice writ large, and how women are holding households together in the middle of a pandemic, which is also central to this dynamic. So the amount of risk and courage that I've seen is historically incredibly encouraging.
And I guess I'll just follow up quickly by saying, one thing that also differs in this moment is that, like the film clip we saw, the civil rights, one of the heaviest critiques is that it was male-dominated and male-centric. We see now queer, trans, and women of color really leading this movement, and their voices are not just being heard, but actually being followed. So I'll say that, and then Zach, just to kind of reemphasize my point that I made earlier, we're also seeing how technology is used in a way that couldn't have been used in decades previous. I mean, the fact that activists in Palestine can actually tweet out in real time to activists across the globe or whomever how to deal with tear gas, I think is a phenomenal feat that just wasn't available in earlier generations.
So I want to pick up on one of those points, and you all have made this sort of in a diffuse this point in a diffuse way already. Who's leading? One of the criticisms that I come across all the time, right, and I'm sure you do too, is it's a movement without leadership. But I wonder if you can elaborate on what the leadership looks like, who it is, or what it is.
Well, it's a community-based approach, and I think with it being decentralized, which you not being able to say, oh, Shavonna Newsom's the head or this person's the head, I think it's more effective. It's easier to stop if there's movements uprising around the world. In terms of what the goals are pretty defined and clear, and we have multiple protests happening around New York City. I was most recently in LA. They were happening there as well. Of course, in Minneapolis, where I was on the ground, where George Floyd lost his life, where they made the arrest and stuff. But I think that we're moving towards liberation. We understand that Black people need education. We understand that police and its core is wrong. When you go back to the Fugitive Slave Act, when you go back to the mercenaries that property owners used to capture us, we understand that we can't have a failing school system and then a highly militarized and well-funded police department. These are the same demands and wants that are coming out of this movement. Now, in terms of leadership, someone like myself and my organization, who has been on the ground for almost 5 years under the title Black Lives Matter Greater New York, it's our role and it's our duty, because there's so many Generation Z, so many woke kids coming out. It's our duty to tell people what's next after protesting. And we've been seeing that with a lot of leaders who have been around for some time. Like, our path to freedom and liberation is all about legislation. That's why we promote candidates to run for office. That's why we've empowered progressive candidates for their federal and local elections. So I think it's having a defined path, also giving people a strategy on how to police themselves, community engagement, how to uplift it. And it's going to be a full collective effort. I don't think that we need a president of Black America. A constitution, a living, breathing document of our wants and needs, that would be most crucial, and showing people how to build that out. So me and my team are taking on that responsibility to give people leadership post-protest to get us where we need to go. But I love the fact that anyone can host a rally and host a march in their frustration, and it helps. It helps people like me with the inside game and the outside game being able to push for that legislation, and people who may have never protested a day in their lives are organizing and taking to the streets. We need the people behind us. So I think that's why this time is so important.
So we're about, what, 7 weeks in to protests that have taken place every day across the nation, and in some ways, not in some ways, but in a number of places also across the globe, right? It's necessary to have people in the street protesting, but I'm curious about, what if you can't physically go out to a march or a protest? What would you recommend all of you, and especially in terms of coalition building, especially also in terms of some of the goals, Professor Smiley, that you mentioned about policing and defunding? How can you participate now without physically being in a space?
So I guess
No, you go ahead. I feel like I'm talking too much. You go ahead.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different strategies to movement building. I think, there are folks who are writing about it, documenting it. There's the legal aspect to it. There's those who are going to, call your local legislators to demand change. There are folks who are going to do what might be seen as alternative work, but actually part of this movement, right? I mean, if you're doing work that's surrounding housing, food security, working with folks that are marginalized, that's all movement building work. That's all part of this coalition. For me, I'll just speak personally. One thing I remember in 2015, I think it was like November, December 2015, when New York had this really, really large Black Lives Matter protest, and we all started in Washington Square Park, and we all marched, and it was great. By the end of it, it didn't feel good. It felt bad, because I'm like, we're giving all this OT to police officers. They're getting money for us to be out here. I mean, there is, an idea, and I saw this on Twitter, and my apologies for not remembering who to credit it to, but they said, anytime you have a protest that has, a piece of paper from the police, it's more of a parade. It's not a march, So, we have to be very strategic on what we're doing, and knowing that we all have different strengths in different arenas, and we need to make sure that we capitalize on that.
It's true, and one of the things that I would add to that is that new media produces new political spaces and new political actors. So the fact of simply sharing a post from a reliable source that you follow and that you trust and that you've vetted, and sharing it with your immediate community opens up possibility for the type of change that might be meaningful outside of the in the street protest work that happens. Also, we talked, and many of us touched on this, if only tangentially, which is the question of decolonizing the curriculum. It shouldn't fall on African American studies, on Latino studies, Asian American studies, to really bring to the fore what it means to have a robust and clear evidence-based American cultural history that values documents across ethnicities, races, gender orientations. So there's various ways of doing that. We could do it in the classroom, we could do it in our faculty meetings, and we could do it with an understanding that new political subjects are emerging, and that we need to really vet these political subjects and what is shared, because we always want to be both on the side of justice, but also on the side of accuracy. We have to resist the pull to post something that might be provocative, but will be actually counter to our productive ends. And that's part of where we need to learn, both activist circles, academia, and those young woke people that are actually making the changes meaningful for the next generation. So working in tandem is a way of doing that.
And I agree with both of you gentlemen. And I love what you said about the piece of paper and it being parade. To exercise our constitutional rights, we don't feel the need to have a parade or sound permit, and police do not lead our march. Usually if they know we're having a march, they shut it down and bring their choppers out. So we don't really interact with them like that. But I just think that there are and this is the question I get from a lot of people. There are people who use their art form. I like to call them artivists. They're photographers. There are people who do graphics, memes, media. There are people, as you've seen recently in Occupy City Hall, who could not be down there every day, but they were dropping off food. There was mental health services on the ground. We have nurses who come out. So any talent that you have and you're passionate about, you can contribute to this movement right now, from calling your politicians to how about starting something in your own community, because the coalition part is definitely coming from building up your own community. So beautifying your neighborhood. People in the Bronx have been going around and cleaning up their neighborhood. That's a part of our liberations, having a clean and safe place to live. Housing justice, we've been calling for the canceling of rent. So there's multiple ways to liberate us. And I just want to keep emphasizing, it's not just police brutality that kills people who look like me. You have to think about food injustice. You have to think about environmental injustice and all the systemic ways that we have been oppressed in this country. And if you have any small skill set, there's a way for you to get involved in this movement.
So let's now take a question from the audience.
Hello, everybody. I've got some questions here, and we don't have much time, so I'll try to distill them down just to a couple. Several of the questions that have been coming in throughout the discussion are from a student perspective, from Kyla Gamaro and Jennifer Ruiz and others. They're asking, what advice would you give to students on balancing activism, education, work, and social life? And how does one prevent burnout in themselves and in those around them? And as a part two to that, what are some actionables that future social workers and educators might take to dismantle systemic racism? For the panel.
Yeah.
So I'll go. The first part is really important. How do you, keep that social? How do you keep your activism going, but also don't burn out? And the simple question is, you have to have alternative outlets. You have to learn and know when to unplug, when to put down Twitter. You need to have, your groups, your people that you can, lean on. You can express yourself without judgment. I think that's really important. So I'll just say that, and then I'll let others.
I agree. The toughest part about being an activist, as I was a congressional candidate and full-time activist, this is the first time in 14 months that I've taken a couple days off. So most of the time you'll hear me, my voice will be completely raspy from leading thousands of people in protests or staying up all night to strategize or fighting these career politicians who don't want to give us our just due. So people need to find a way to step away. I think that the movement can survive without you for 4 to 5 days. That's something I very much struggle with in terms of being in college. Please use your social media platforms, organize your small groups, and find balance. You have to find time for things that are truly important to you. Being on the front line, a lot of your personal things you love, they stop because you're so focused on the full liberation, and you need to be around like-minded people. And what I've noticed in these most recent uprising and protests is there's a huge presence on mental health. So say even down at Occupy City Hall, there were social workers and counselors out there. And for people who are going into those fields, think about the community that you're going to serve and represent. Think about maybe serving people who you understand their struggles. We find in Black and Brown communities that people don't understand the traumas that come with growing up Black in America. So please do your research, use your resources and your education to serve. As far as teachers too, getting involved, our director of education is actually opening up a Montessori school this fall. So there's so many ways to get involved and never feel like you're not doing enough. Like I carry that guilt, I guess, being a Black woman, carrying that burden of trying to save the world on my back. What you're doing is enough. Just be committed to it and consistent about it. Put it on your calendar. And I think that you can cope.
We also have a lot of questions coming in from the point of view of those who would like to be an ally. Claire Leto, I think, phrased it well. What can I do as an ally to ensure that I'm using my privilege to further the fight for equality rather than overshadowing the voices of the oppressed? And that's also a general question for the panel.
I heard that mentioned earlier, and all right, because I know that's been a huge topic, and a lot of the interviews and stuff I'm doing, they're asking about allies coming out. I think it's important that the leadership and the thoughts and the clear goal be defined by Black people and other people of color, because that is their struggle. But my allies before the uprising of George Floyd would marshal parades and put their bodies in the way of policing, and just being conscious of your privilege. There are things that will happen because you have less melanin in your skin. Like, you will not suffer as harshly. And as we see with so many allies coming out, when young white kids are upset in America, America responds. So I'm encouraging all of the allies to come out. And if my people can benefit from you being out there protesting, camping out, shutting in, fighting the power, I welcome you to join me and Black Lives Matter Greater New York in this fight.
You know, one of the most difficult things for young people is the question of having to educate over and over again various constituencies from their home, from folks that are tangentially interested but are clueless. Part of how an ally can help is by doing that educational outreach, that commitment to social justice in a way that prevents the person of color from consistently being the one who is both educating, defending, and shielding processes at play. So using that privilege strategically is going to be key, which means stepping in and also knowing when to retreat and setting the agenda, as Shavonna just said. That agenda has to be set predominantly by those who are in the leadership position, because they're the ones who have traditionally stood to lose the most from not being heard. So being strategic about when to step in and when to step back is really going to be key.
We have a question here about social media. It has a massive effect on everything we do, says Regis Anama. What are ways to avoid performative activism or activism simply for the sake of trending? Is there a line between actual activism and performative activism? If so, what is that line?
Yeah, I think today we saw a great act of performative activism with the painting of Black Lives Matter in front of Trump Tower. I mean, you know, for weeks now, people have been saying defund the police, reinvest money into other parts of the community. And de Blasio's response has been, hey, how about we paint a bunch of Black Lives Matter in yellow paint? And people are saying, this is not what we want. So you clearly don't get it. So, you know, that's one point. I think that, you know, I think performative activism does play a role in the sense that it gets people at least talking, but it can't be the only thing that you do. You can't just like things on Facebook. You can't just change your profile pic and think that that's going to make global change that we're looking for. I think, you know, that's maybe some people's maybe first step into the activist role or into the role of making change, but you have to then take it a step further. I don't think taking down statues of Confederate soldiers as simply performative. I think that that's actually needed. That's my personal opinion.
And I think it needs to be seen. We know that some people, just like we have people who are poverty pimps who like to take pictures in poor locations. If someone taking a cool Instagram picture is going to bring like 20 diehards out, or maybe 100, you know what? Snapchat and Instagram chat away. If it wasn't for social media, the world wouldn't have known about George Floyd. And what I think we need in this activism space, we need to stop judging people. We need to really look at it and think about what's the underlying cause. Yeah, a picture's cool and trending is cool, but they still got up and they came outside. They're no longer couch revolutionaries, people who have like these great opinions, but they never leave their home. They never join into the fight. I think there's space for everyone, from the social influencer point, who is going to touch more people who will genuinely care and think that even if you think it's cool to come out the first time, it's something about activism that kind of pulls you in. So it may be a few Instagrams and hashtags and artwork you want to see, but once you get ingrained with the people and in the struggle, you become committed and you join in long term. So please hashtag away. I think Black Lives Matter gets about 17 million before George Floyd hashtags per day. Join in the fight. I'm sure if you're out there long enough, some of the messaging, the info, it'll stick in and it'll pull you to want to do more. So tag me in your posts, guys.
Weston, do you have any final thoughts before we move on to breakout rooms?
Yeah, so I think we should thank our panelists for really this, I think, powerful and profound interrogation of what Black Lives Matter means in this moment and how to stay informed and engaged. So I'd like to thank them and thank also everyone who's viewing. Will now transition to the breakout rooms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.